Hello everyone, and welcome to another Psych Boost CPD video. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting a guest whose work has significantly impacted psychology education, Lucinda Powell. Lucinda is the creator and host of the Psychology in the Classroom podcast. This is dedicated to translating psychological research into practical strategies for educators. Through insightful interviews with leading psychologists and deep dives into educational theories, she provides teachers with tools to enhance their teaching practices and improve student outcomes. In addition to her podcast, Lucinda is a psychology teacher and assistant director of teaching and learning in South Oxfordshire. As part of her role, she integrates psychological principles into teaching practices to support colleagues' teaching, drive evidence-based change, and improve learning within her school. She very much enjoys the occasional outing to other schools, delivering training and workshops to staff and pupils on a range of topics. Lucinda's dedication to psychology education was recognised when she was honoured with the British Psychological Society's Pre-Territory Psychology Teacher of the Year Award in 2023. In today's interview, we'll explore Lucinda's insights on fostering resilience and empowering students, particularly in navigating and learning from failure. We'll discuss how a fear of failure can inhibit learning and effective responses to errors in the classroom. I've gathered together the tips covered in this interview into a free handout. And if what we cover inspires you to talk to your students about how to cope with failure, then I've made a handout you can give to them too. Both of these are in the free section of my Patreon. This video is part of a series of CPD videos where I talk to psychology educators I've met at the annual ATP conference. If you'd like to meet me and many of the people who've taken part in these interviews, I recommend you come along. So let's dive in and discuss with Lucinda Powell how we can support our students in building resilience and embracing the learning opportunities that come from failure. Thank you, Lucinda, for joining me on this talk about the fear of failure. Thank you for spending the time to answer some questions.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Brilliant. So shall we dive straight in?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay. So in your experience, how does the fear of failure show itself in students?
So I think it's generally their behaviours and what you see in the classroom. Sometimes it's stuff that's not in the classroom, but generally you're going to have, the most obvious one will be that if you're having a class discussion, they just won't participate in the discussion. So they won't put the hand up. They might sit back and let other people do the work. So that would be kind of typical behaviours. I think the other one, which I've struggled with some of my students, is cheating. So, that's particularly in independent work. And I did say to one student the other day who'd used AI to do a piece of homework, I was like, I'd rather you got 0 and it's all your own work than you got 25 out of 25 and it was all AI. Because
how did you pick up on that? How did you notice that it was failure? Was it very, very obvious?
So we're really lucky in our school. We have an amazing head of e-learning who's given us so much training. So was things like he was using words he would never use. The spelling was Americanized. So it had the Z's and behavior didn't have a U. Also, like there were triplets, so things in threes, which AI likes to use. And also I've learned recently that when we talk, we tend to talk in sort of long sentences and then a short sentence and it's called burstiness. It's a lovely word. So if you prompt AI to say burstiness, it will do it. But if you don't prompt it, the sentences are all kind of the same length.
Wow. I did not know that. I'll definitely look out for that now.
So so I picked up that he'd done it on AI, using AI, and he fessed up to it. And I was just like, the problem with this, obviously, is it's great because now you haven't failed, but it tells us nothing about actually how you're going to do in the exam when you can't cheat and you can't use AI. And so again, that's a really typical kind of way of getting around the failure. So yes, I think that, those are the kind of clear behaviours. Obviously as well, when you hand tests back, you're going to get the emotional response, which I think we'll probably talk about a little bit more in detail. But yeah, you get the emotional response of that fear of failure. But also things like, fear of failure, again, we'll talk about it later, but links to perfectionism. So sometimes just the getting started. So, you can you give them a task and they sit there and they just don't do the task. Even if it's a really low stakes, write something on your whiteboard.
Yeah.
Thing, which I use mini whiteboards a lot. I absolutely love them because I think they are really low stakes, because at the end of the day they can rub it out, and if they've made a mistake, it doesn't matter, nobody's going to remember. But I think there's, again, that's that actually getting started sometimes, that fear of failure.
I also am a big fan of mini whiteboards. The high tempo that you can do with a mini whiteboard to just put something down, rub it out, turn the board over, show. But we might talk about that again a little later, talking about classroom techniques. Any indications of, say, like emotional responses from the students, even before you've handed anything back about fear of failure? Like which students potentially might be most at risk?
That's a really good question. I think, as always, it's about knowing your students. It's usually, I say, girls have a higher fear of failure. Doesn't mean to say that boys don't, but girls are at higher risk. Again, quite often neurodivergent students might be at higher risk. We see greater things like exam anxiety is higher in girls. Perfectionism is quite high in people with autism. So again, it's really about knowing your students, and it's fear. I mean, fear of failure, not sort of thinking about exam anxiety and test anxiety. It's actually, if you're giving something back, you might find the student arrives late. If they know they're getting something back, they might not arrive to the lesson. Equally, obviously, if there's a fear of failure, they might not turn up to the test in the first place. They don't hand in their homework, they avoid handing it. So all of these, it's all about anxiety, and that it comes down to that emotional regulation. And it's a fear, it's a real fear, and it manifests in all of the kind of safety behaviours you see with any anxiety. So avoidance is the typical one. You might see someone again checking and checking and checking their work and really picking, that nitpicking, but also things like picking up. So when they're going through it, they're then obviously thinking about, well, I've got it wrong. I've picked out, like, who can I blame? So you get a lot of pushback with, I certainly do, when I've marked something about, like, why have you marked it this way? This is your fault. You haven't taught me this. I haven't, So again, kind of the language that they use.
I think you've spoken about locus of control before, haven't you? And the kind of perspective on that type of student. Yeah.
So again, it's like this. I'm going to blame it elsewhere. So you place the blame. I can take control. So one thing is to take control and say, I failed. I didn't do enough revision. In future, I'm going to do this. And like quite often, I talk with students about controlling the controllables. So what am I in control of? I'm in control of how much revision I do, what I revise, how I manage my time and my revision. And so there's thinking about kind of ways that we can help students. That is, we can go down the kind of route of control the controllables, but if they're failing and they're fearful of failure, that control, they're going to blame other people and other circumstances. I think things like, I ran out of time, or I wasn't expecting that question. That's the other one, isn't it?
It is on the topic, so
or we haven't done that kind of question. I get quite often, we haven't done a 12 marker before like that. But you don't know what's going to happen in the exam. You might have to be a little bit creative in the exam. So again, they'll find excuses as to what, and I know I do it as well. I don't know about you, but I like when things don't go right, my immediate response is to go, it's not my fault. It's not my fault. So I blame it on someone else. And then I have to, but again, it comes like thinking about that emotional response. Whenever we fail, whenever we do something that feels really uncomfortable, we immediately find a way out. And my immediate response is to blame somebody else. Once I've sat with that emotion and gone, okay, like, no, it was totally my fault. I did screw up. I should have done it this way. That I can kind of accept responsibility. But I think we don't often let our students sit with that emotion for long enough to come to terms with it.
That responsibility brings us neatly onto the second question, which is an idea about how can we support an individual student in dealing with their fear of failure?
Yeah. Well, I think, like, as you said, nicely leading in, because I think the first thing is actually sitting with those uncomfortable emotions and really teaching them that it's okay. It's okay to be uncomfortable and to learn to manage that. It's a life skill, right? We are going to screw up. We are going to fail. However you want to define failure, there will be times when we fail, and it's horrible. It's a horrible feeling, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's in our work, whether it's in our academic life, as I fail a lot as a parent. That feeling is really horrible, and it comes back to haunt you. And I think you've just got to sit there and kind of acknowledge it and go, this is how it's going to feel. It will pass. And a really wise friend of mine once said to me, okay, something was going horribly wrong. And she just said, look, project forward a week. How are you going to feel in a week about this? And I was like, oh, I probably would have forgotten it. She was like, yeah,
that's true.
So, actually, we have a failure. And in that moment, it feels really, really horrible. But in a week's time, we'll be thinking about something else. We will have learned from this failure and we'll be moving on. So it is that it's learning to sit uncomfortably and allowing those emotions to pass, because they don't last long. And everybody responds, and the challenge is, I think, for teachers is that everybody's failure is different and everybody's response to failure is different. So you've got two students who may have exactly the same grade, percentage mark, whatever, and for one they're in floods of tears and it's a disaster and the whole world is falling apart. The other one's like, they're going, hey, I didn't get 40%.
Yeah.
So it's really hard. And I think, again, just having those conversations about, the language we use, being really careful of how we as teachers respond in the moment. So again, you've got your two students, one's got 75%, they've both got 75%, one's it's brilliant and the other one's really disappointed. It's about responding appropriately to that and not letting our expectations show, because they're really quick at picking up on your body language. And when you raise, you just need to raise an eyebrow, even if you're saying all the right words. You raise an eyebrow, it's really problematic. So
yeah, because we know these students, we have our expectations of how they're going to perform as well. But yeah, that can very much feed through to that sense of anxiety, I guess, when they get that paper back. Yeah,
particularly if they don't want to disappoint you as well, because there's that it's that interpersonal stuff as well. And I think I haven't mentioned it, but fear of failure is intrapersonal, so it's within ourselves. It's about how we feel. It's very much a kind of this visceral feeling, and about disappointing our own goals, but also there's a interpersonal element of it, and one of that is disappointment. So I'm going to disappoint my parents, I'm going to disappoint my teachers, but the other one is like, how are other people going to judge me? They're going to see me as a failure, they're going to see me as not good enough, and that interpersonal element of it is really difficult to manage as well. So just being really aware of that is important.
So would you have any advice on a particular type of language that we might use around students when, say, like handing back work, and maybe there's a situation where they've experienced some failure? I'm sort of trying to think of examples where that's happened. And obviously, I've had plenty in my very many years of teaching where, you've had kids in facilities. I think it is about just taking them outside and sitting down and saying, okay, and just unpicking it. Why do they feel like that? And I do think go through the process.
Yeah, and talk about the fact that it's temporary, the fact that this doesn't define who they are. Yes, it might feed into their predicted grade, but there's lots of other things that, that's for me as an A-level teacher, that's usually that, I've done so badly and it's going to affect my predicted grade and then I won't get university grade. And then I'm just like, actually that's
really catastrophizing from such a small, tiny data point to a whole lifetime of.
Yeah. So absolutely. So I think, again, just unpicking their thinking behind it and then talking them through it. And if you think about cognitive behavioral therapy, we as teachers can, although we're not clinical psychologists, you can do it. It's just basically about unpicking their thoughts and restructuring the negative thoughts that they're having. So if they're having really negative thoughts, I love use catastrophizing. There's a really lovely handout with different types of problematic and unhelpful thinking styles. So like catastrophizing, mental, jumping to conclusions, rational reasoning. Catastrophizing is a good example of what a lot of students do. I failed one test, the end of the world is nigh.
Yeah.
Or the other one is that typical is like, I failed one test, I am stupid. So so just thinking about that and then sort of saying, okay, well, is that the case? And really unpicking the thinking behind that. What evidence do you have that this one test is going to affect something that's going to happen a year and a half down the line? And it can bring
maybe
them
even
back.
In that case, making explicit the point of classroom tests being to improve later performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, one of the things about fear of failure is risk taking. So it really reduces the risk taking, and actually to learn and to push yourself to move into that zone of proximal development, to really challenge what you're doing. You need to take risks. You need to challenge yourself. And students who have a fear of failure don't do that. They stay nicely within their comfort zone of what they can do. One of the problems with that is that typical revision techniques involve reading, rereading, copying notes, that kind of thing, which gives this amazing illusion of fluency, like illusion that I've learned it, I know it, and actually 24 hours later, if you test me, I'm going to do super well in a test, which is how most kids revise for end of topic tests. But in reality, that's not what you're going to do when you get to the end of your A level. So we really need to encourage them to take risks with things like revision and say, actually, I want you to revise using a different strategy. I want you to revise by doing 10 minutes every day rather than an hour before the test. And I want you to use flashcards. I want you to use testing. And I want to see how that works. And giving them permission to try different things, knowing that if they completely mess it up, it's not a disaster. And that takes a lot of courage, I think, for students, because they see end of topic tests like, this is a big thing. It's going to go towards my predicted grade. And actually, I think that there should be, there should be more to the predicted grade than just, the end of topic test.
Maybe sometimes we're blamed for hyping those things up just a little bit more than they need to be, rather than explaining that it is about progress rather than an end result with those end topic tests.
Yeah. I like reframing mocks and end of topic tests, because I think, they do see it as like literally all it is an assessment of how well I'm doing. Okay. And if I fail this, I am a failure. I try and reframe it and sort of say, actually, there are loads of reasons we do this. One is to practice. So you know what you're good at. Have you got your timing right for your exam? Have you got your, can you write enough? Are you writing the right sorts of things? And, you also about revision. It's about practicing your revision. Have you got the revision technique sorted? That kind of thing. But also it's for me as a teacher, because if they all get question X wrong, I know that I need to go back and we've got some misconceptions, or I haven't taught it well enough, or whatever it is. I know that I need to redo something or help everybody with this. So there's loads of reasons why we do end of topic tests. It's not just an assessment. And I think we lose sight of that in the kind of blur of trying to get everybody through the curriculum and onto the exams and ready and raring to go, because it's such a short amount of time to get so much covered.
So moving on from individual students, which we've covered quite well about how to help them, can we talk now maybe what some of the effective methods are for managing errors and failures in the classroom so we can create a more supportive learning culture?
So, I think a lot of what I've probably already said will help.
Spend it out, yeah.
Because again, although you're talking to maybe one student, the other students will see that. But I think it's really hard if you're one teacher in one classroom doing something different to the rest of your school. It's really hard to overcome a kind of that where there's no psychological safety in a school. But you absolutely can create that within your classroom. What we want is a classroom that is psychologically safe. So children are willing to take risks. They're not afraid of failing. They see that failing is going to lead to learning, and that is all okay. But in order to do that, you need to really think about the language that you use, but also it's not just about the words, because we can all talk the talk, but it's about walking the walk and actually taking risks and demonstrating that failure is okay and that you fail. And obviously we can tell stories about, I failed this, but they need to see it. They need to see you doing it. So one really easy way to do that is to not worry too much about how brilliant your PowerPoints are and make mistakes on your PowerPoint and go, oh, look, there's the typo. It's like we do have a bit of a competition in our class about who can spot the typo first. And so, they know that I make mistakes on my PowerPoints because I try to put, Russia School never quite put them together in time to check them. So yes,
modelling yourself like you're not defensive when you make mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. But also so we are research informed schools, so we do a lot of work around the evidence of teaching, and I love doing little experiments in the class. So again, I'll go, right, I'm going to try something new today, guys. It might be a complete disaster, but let's have a go. And I get them to give me my feedback at the end. It's like, was that useful? What do you think? This is why I did it. And sometimes they go, oh no, miss, I don't think we should do that. We didn't like that at all. And sometimes they're like, yeah, it's brilliant. But I'm trying new things in my area of expertise in terms of being a teacher. And they know that sometimes I'll get it wrong. And that for me is quite powerful, I think, for them to see. So yeah, I think it's really about that role modeling, because you have got to live, you've got to live that it's okay to fail. And again, also talking about your emotions, I think, and being a little bit more vulnerable. But again, it's something that teachers really struggle with. And maybe, I don't know, I think I'm naturally quite able to be vulnerable. But I will sit there and go, do you know what, I feel really uncomfortable, and I know that I've really screwed up and I'm really sorry. And it makes me, because we do make like I will realise, I'll go away and realise I've taught something incorrectly because I don't know why I've done it, but I've done something wrong, and I've just got, you have to go back. I'm really sorry, guys, I got this wrong, and I feel really bad because we kind of wasted time, and I've wasted your time, and now you're going to be, we've got to start again. So let's, and I think they actually value that. So again, being vulnerable and knowing. I mean, we've talked a little bit about perfectionism. I mentioned it, but I think a lot of teachers are perfectionists, and that also is, part of a fear of failure is wrapped up so closely with perfectionism that if we are trying to be perfect and we are not wanting to show the vulnerability of getting it wrong, then we are not walking the walk. And I think that's really something we should reflect on as individuals and as adults. What messages are we giving when we are perfect?
So I think, would you have an explicit conversation with the students, your class as a whole, about failure? I imagine you would, but I mean, I imagine, should most teachers, after hearing this, stand in front of the classroom and have a conversation about failure? And then what would be the key points to kind of give in that kind of audience?
I think it's one of those things where I think if you just stood up and said, right, it's okay to fail, and and have that one-off kind of like, it's probably not enough. It needs to be constant drip feed, right? We're going to try this. You will get it. I mean, I'm always saying you will get it wrong. You will forget things. We walk out of the room and we forget 90% of what we've heard. Like, people will stop, turn this video off and forget 90% of what I've said. Yeah. Hopefully, no. But they'll just remember the key bits, the really important bits. And so, of course, when they come back into your classroom 3 days later and they've had 50 billion lessons and a whole load of other things gone, they will have forgotten 90%. They're not going to remember. So actually, if you say, right, we've forgotten what we've learned last time, so let's remind ourselves who can remember. And if you can't remember, that's fine. And so I think it's really important to be constantly drip feeding. We will forget. We are not perfect. We don't remember everything we've been told. We will get things wrong, particularly when we're trying or when we're learning, because we get things muddled up. We're not experts. So I think it's about that constant drip feed of education. So
even before an activity starts, potentially, like a mini whiteboard activity where you're doing high tempo questions, having that conversation about saying, well, you know what, actually, it's okay to fail in the situation. I'm expecting it. And, maybe even it's beneficial, like a conversation I'll often have, and I don't necessarily sure about the validity of this completely. So I often talk about in evolutionary terms, I'm like, our brain is primed to respond emotionally to failure. If you're walking through a forest, evolutionary times, and you fail in recognizing a tiger hiding in the bushes, suddenly your brain goes into override and go, oh, I need to learn from this mistake. Whereas often we won't learn from non-mistakes. So, I'm going to try and put you in situations where you'll make a mistake, we'll correct it, and then hopefully that'll bury itself in a little better. So I'm trying to have these conversations constantly about why it is a good thing to have failure in our practice, whether that's completely true or not.
No, absolutely. So when we emotionally tag memories, then we're more likely to remember them. So it's like a really good example is, like, and I'm sure you can think of times when this has happened where, like, you, particularly in the classroom, you get kids to put their hands up. Or I do a lot of cold calling in the classroom, and of course sometimes they get it wrong. And they're like, they put their hand up and then they say something, and you're just like, whoa, where did that come out? So again, if you go, no, that's absolutely wrong, they're going to feel that shame, that embarrassment, the judgment of others. They're going to emotionally tag that memory. They are not going to make that mistake again. And I say that, it's like, well, okay, that feels really uncomfortable right now. I can see why, and usually I caveat it with something like, oh, I can see it was a hard question, or I can see why you made that mistake. That's a really common error. You're not going to make that mistake again because now you've made it. You're going to get it right next time. And that kind of, again, there's always that feeling of when we're cold calling and somebody gets it wrong. It's like, how do you deal with that? And just saying something like, well, you've learned from that error. How brilliant is that?
Sometimes it's very tempting to jump through a whole bunch of loops to kind of make them almost right, which I guess is our defense mechanism to try and lower the emotional temperature in there. But actually, maybe sometimes it is okay just to say, well, actually, that was just kind of wrong. Let's deal with it and move on. Yeah.
And, again, it's it might be that nobody else could get it right. So I'm always like, brilliant for having a go. That was a hard question. I can completely see where you've come from. It's wrong. And they've got to learn. If they make that kind of big error, they've got to learn from that. And they will emotionally tag it. Then it becomes what we call in psychology an episodic memory rather than a semantic memory. So it becomes something like, oh my goodness, that really embarrassing time when I put my hands up and got it completely wrong. And so,
See, I love the technique of asking a question and saying, well, everybody put your hand up if you think you can answer this question. Let's give it a little bit of time to breathe. Seeing the hands come up, and then you very quickly indicate who's never putting their hands up, maybe someone to talk to. But then, if only 4 hands go up in a sea of hands and someone answers the question, and it's incorrect, well, actually, yeah, you're right. Well done for being brave, because from the hands that didn't go up, you're not alone in not knowing the answer to this question. So well done for being brave enough to potentially fail.
Yeah, and take that risk, and then you can bring in the risk taking. So, like, going back to your kind of question,
praising that individual, and everyone else hears the praise for the risk rather than the right answer.
Yeah, and that's your drip feeding of culture, rather than sitting there and going, failure is a really great thing. You're one big, it has to be the drip feed. They have to know that every day they're safe in your classroom to have a go and to make a mistake. And, as I say, I use cold calling a lot. So they get used to being asked a question they don't know the answer to. And actually knowing that it's okay to say, I don't know, that's another, that, because some kids, that's still a failure. I don't know the answer to this. Again, caveat, right? We did this. You've probably forgotten it. We're going to do it anyway. So just the drip feed and the messages that you give every single day about it's okay to fail in my classroom. What you can do is you can say, okay, there are times when it's not okay. I want you to try really hard. We are testing. We are doing something that's really important. And then you just make that really explicit. And you say, okay, today, this is not about failure. This is about showing what you know. And that's fine. If they know that every other time, so again, being explicit between the different situations in your classroom.
So I know we've touched on it briefly, but I know that you think a related issue that you found is one of perfectionism. So how is this, do you feel, is directly related to students' approach to failure?
So perfectionism is kind of interesting. You kind of have healthy perfectionism, which is sometimes called striving for excellence, which is easier than calling it healthy perfectionism. And then you have the kind of unhealthy kind. Now, obviously, we want our students to be striving for excellence, which means taking risks, trying things. But when you get perfectionism, it is like this intense fear of failure that it's got to be absolutely perfect. And when you have a perfectionist, it again, going back to those unhelpful thinking styles, it's pervasive, it's permanent, and it's personal. So 3 Ps. So pervasive means it's everything. It's all about everything I do. So if I don't get this perfect, it is about me as a person and the fact that everything about me is not perfect, and and I can't change that, so it's permanent. Whereas striving for excellence is kind of, actually it's not personal, it's temporary, it's a thing that's just happened. So you can kind of see the difference between those two, but within that is wrapped up this kind of this failure is not an option. And so then we see similar behavior. So we see this procrastination, this inability to get started on things. So they might not be able to start even just writing the essay because I can't start because what if I get it wrong? So, or they might start, but they again start again and again and again and again because they can't get it right, and that obviously ends up just leading to this paralysis of like, actually I can't do it at all. I can't do it, hand off, and then you get the avoidance. The other thing that I think is quite interesting about perfectionism, which I didn't realise till quite recently, is that they have quite rigid rules. So quite often people with perfectionism will have very rigid rules about I have to get, like, what is failure? I have to get 80%. And it's quite interesting, and I don't know, but I'm going to speak to someone quite soon actually about this, but it seems like it overlaps quite closely with some of the OCD type traits. So with those compulsions, I have to eat for 20 minutes. I have to, it just looks like it's the compulsive behavior. It's not the obsessive thoughts. But so that's quite interesting. But these rigid rules are, I have to write 3 pages for my 16-mark essay or whatever it is. So it has, these really, if I don't do that, then it's not perfect and I'm going to fail. And so you see kind of similar behaviors, but kind of to an extreme almost with perfectionism. So yeah, it is really problematic. But
it's quite difficult because all class tests are not made equal. You've just got one essay and a few short questions. Well, depending on your choice of essay, some are quite tricky, some are quite easy. So if they've got this line 80% is where I need to be all of the time, well, they're going to swing either side of that quite regularly, just based on your choice of how you've put together that class test.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, like, marking is so subjective, particularly in our subject. I'm sure, may not be as subjective in other subjects, but even so, I mean, going back to that, we forget quite a lot of what we're taught. And if you haven't, or if you've missed a lesson because you've been unwell and you haven't quite understood it, there are all sorts of really genuinely good reasons why we might not get 80%. And so it is absolutely debilitating. And in worst case scenario, you end up with kind of extreme anxiety, that might be test anxiety, it might be just generalized anxiety that you can't do anything, and you end up avoiding really important things that are going to allow you to grow and become a well-rounded, good individual. So that, it's really problematic, because obviously perfectionism and fear of failure as well, but we're talking about particularly in the classroom, but also all of these things kind of stretch out into all of the extracurricular stuff that we do. So, I don't want to participate in sports because I might not hit the ball in hockey correctly, or I don't want to join science club because I might look stupid in front of everybody else who's really, really clever, or I don't want to pick up a musical instrument because it might sound horrible. So that it extends out, and then you start avoiding everything, and you don't take risks in any element of your life, and then that's really problematic. Because
I feel like some of the strategies we've talked about dealing with fear of failure, though, would also deal with this kind of sense of always needing to be perfect. Because if we're putting in safe places to fail, then that's going to hopefully translate into an interpretation where we go, well, it's okay to not be perfect, because actually when I do fail, the consequences aren't as horrific as what I originally imagined.
Yeah, I think sort of looking at one of the kind of elements of CBT, CBT is really, it's fascinating, CBT, but one of the things that you can do is just look at the evidence of, well, what happened when you last failed? Like, when did something go wrong? When, they need to describe the failure as something that they think is a failure. Well, actually, what happened? How did you feel a day later? How did you feel a week later? How many people do you think remember that moment where, because I'm sure we can all think back to things that just went, where, the example I always give the kids is my GCSE maths. I finished about 20 minutes early. I was like really chuffed. I was like, oh, look at this. And I checked it all through, and I was like, oh, I've done really well. I'm really well. The 2-minute warning was given. You'd have got 2 minutes left. And I turned over the paper, and the whole of the back page had a list of questions that I hadn't seen. And I just remember my stomach, that absolute sensation of my stomach dropping out onto the floor, and like, oh my goodness. So I kind of busy, like 2 minutes left, and I'm trying desperately to do these maths questions. I don't know how many marks it was, but I clearly, I lost marks. I didn't, but probably the fact that I spent 20 minutes checking everything else meant I'd probably done okay, and my grade was fine. So even though in that moment of I just can remember that sensation, that moment of intense failure, it was a massive failure. Actually, it didn't matter. It didn't matter in the business. I still got a really good grade. I don't think my grade would have been any different. So, it didn't matter. And anyway, who cares? Nobody asks me about my blooming maths GCSE now anyway. So in the big scheme of things, it doesn't matter. So yeah.
Okay. I feel that's a great, it doesn't matter is a great point to finish this interview anyway. Thank you so much for taking part and talking to me for this last half hour.
Well, that's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
I've attended the ATP conference most years I've been a teacher. As well as providing incredible value CPD and great networking, it's also a very enjoyable event that I look forward to all year. I really recommend all psychology teachers join the ATP and, if possible, attend the conference. I want to thank all the students and teachers who support the Psych Boost project. My ability